Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Welcome back to Clearer Than Truth. I'm host Nathan Kiker, along with co-host George Bogdan. Today, we're thrilled to welcome back a definitive voice in geopolitical suspense and a phenomenal repeat guest on our show. Number one New York Times bestselling author Brad Thor. Brad joins us to discuss his incredible new thriller, Chokepoint. The story follows Scott Harvath into a web of high-stakes tradecraft as he uncovers an elite Beijing intelligence plot designed to trigger a military coup and seize control of a vital maritime gateway. It's a brilliant, terrifyingly plausible look at the real-world tensions surrounding Chinese expansionism and naval dominance. Brad, welcome back to Clearer Than Truth.
Good afternoon. 3 more. Do I get a jacket? Like the SNL 5 Timers Club?
I think you do. I think you do. We have to design them, but we'll have you in mind when we do. So, Brad, the strategic heart of this book, Chokepoint, is China's effort to seize control of a narrow land corridor in Thailand. It's a gateway between two oceans. But beyond the immediate plot, though, what's the worst case strategic reality for the U.S. if China successfully controls this passage?
Yeah, happy to do that. You guys know that I do fiction and I like to set my plots against real life geopolitics. So I have long been fascinated with China's Belt and Road Initiative. And for those, you've got a very, very smart, very well-informed audience, and I'm sure they know what it is. But for those who don't know, it's essentially China identify in countries where they'd like to have influence, they identify infrastructure projects and then offer to come in and provide the engineers and financing and everything, whether it's to improve port systems, railway networks, road systems, things like that. And essentially what happens is it's the camel has its nose in the tent, as the old, I think it's Bedouin proverb goes. And as soon as the nose is in the tent, the rest of the camel follows pretty quickly. So China then finds itself in these countries in a position of influence, whether it's to exert influence over foreign policy, domestic policy, they're able to do stuff. I'm fascinated by soft power. Okay. And it's one of the things that just in the real world really bothered me about Doge and Elon Musk. And I don't mind trying to identify and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. Everybody talks about it. Very few people do anything about it. What bothers me is when you put 22-year-old kids who have no idea how government works in charge of identifying waste, fraud, and abuse. And all they do is cancel contracts as they did and shut down USAID, which was a tremendous source of soft power for the United States. And now China is stepping in around the world to fill that void. And the benefit of soft power, and you get a lot of myopic people that don't understand, it's my tax dollars, I don't want them going overseas. Soft power makes it possible to not have to use hard power. And that's one of the things that, our citizenry is very easily swayed and is very underinformed on a lot of very important issues. So I try to weave into my books geopolitical issues, but make them exciting and show Americans what the stakes are. So back to your original question with Chokepoint, this idea of China and the Belt and Road Initiative, I asked myself, I said, has any country ever said no to one of China's proposals? They want to come in, they want to do that. Well, it turns out Thailand said no. And they not only said no, they said hell no to Beijing. And so the Chinese had proposed on this narrow strip in southern Thailand, cutting a canal across on a part that's called the Kra Isthmus. And the Chinese wanted to do that because I came up with this book idea, the title Chokepoint, well before the Strait of Malacca. I got very lucky with the idea for the book and the title and everything, because you can't turn on cable news now and not hear the words Chokepoint, 20 times in the first 5 minutes your TV's on. So China pitched Thailand and said, we want to do this canal. And China wanted to do it because they were scared of terrified of the ability that the U.S. Navy has to choke off the Strait of Malacca, which connects the South China Sea with the Indian Ocean. And basically a tremendous amount of Chinese trade and important shipping goes through the Strait of Malacca. And they didn't like that they were kind of at the whim that they could be held hostage by the U.S. Navy. So they pitched this big infrastructure project to Thailand. And in the very southern part of Thailand, the Thai government has a big problem with a Muslim insurgency that wants to split off from Thailand and declare their independence. And one of the big things they were worried about was that if China was allowed to carve a canal across southern Thailand, that immediately you'd have a tsunami of secessionists trying to basically create their own country south of the canal. Also, what's interesting is when the Brits, I never knew this, when the Brits signed their armistice with Thailand at the end of World War II, it's in there that they can't carve a canal across Thailand, which is fascinating to me. A lot of people don't know that. So anyway, now I put this all in my thriller brain, right? And I look at this and I say, how do I make an exciting thriller that Americans will care about? And I said, okay, so Thailand is very in real life. Thailand has had a lot of military coups. The last military coup in Thailand was not that very long ago, 2013, 2014. And so I said, what if the Chinese decided, oh, you're going to tell us no? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to foment such chaos and unrest that there's going to be another military coup in Thailand. And I bet, I being the Chinese thinking, we could get a new military junta to work with us in doing this canal. And so that's the basis for this book, that the Chinese decide they're going to sow so much chaos that the Thai military will step in and take over. And then that'll give them a good negotiating posture. But the way they do it is with terrorism. A lot of Americans get killed in Bangkok when a series of bombings rip through the city. And what's interesting is the Chinese, being the Chinese, they use a cutout, and they use an ex-American tier 1 operator, highly skilled special forces operator that has put himself on the global market to sell his skills. And they use him, and this is somebody from my protagonist, Scott Harvath's former SEAL team. So there's a little bit of connection there. He has Scott Harvath and this guy have pretty much the same training. And so it's this cat and mouse thing through Thailand, trying to stop this guy before he can effectively pull off the Chinese mission and then disassemble the Chinese intelligence unit that's parked in Thailand, calling all the shots on these attacks. So that's kind of the overarching idea for Chokepoint.
Fantastic. I would love to ask about historical analogies just for a little bit, because, before we got on, we were talking about how important it is to kind of be aware of those things when trying to understand international affairs. And I really love, I think, what is a clear, echo of, what happened before D-Day, right, in this book. And, in a sense, China is doing what Eisenhower and others did so brilliantly, in the past. But I mean, I wonder, was it present in your mind, kind of Japan's trouble over, the Straits of Malacca when it was trying to colonize the rest of Asia? Because, I mean, to me, that's a real, kind of surging aspect of this. And should people kind of think about that in Chokepoint's kind of narrative arc, or?
Absolutely. It's that old line that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. So not only with Japan and World War II and the Strait of Malacca, but also something that I wove in was Operation Fortitude, the Allies' plan, where they created that fake army, said Patton was in charge of it, positioned it, inflatable tanks and fake airplanes made of wood. And they positioned that stuff in southern England so that the Luftwaffe pilots that were flying overhead, it made it look like we were massing for a huge attack, not on the beaches of Normandy, but at the nearest point in the English Channel, 25 miles away in Pas-de-Calais. So there is a lot of that history repeats stuff. And so in the book, what the Chinese do is they're trying to draw attention to Taiwan. The NSC is freaking out, particularly the Indo-Pacific people with the NSC are freaking out because it looks like, even though China has this scheduled military exercise, that's actually going to be a mask, that they are really going to go into Taiwan. And the Chinese are amping it up to keep all the attention on Taiwan so that they can pull off what they want to pull off in Thailand. So that's very much akin with some of the stuff in World War II. So it was a good catch, George.
Very good. I mean, I love that you're really touching on, I think, a kind of exciting element of international affairs, which is shipping lanes, because this is, something that is dear to my heart, as you know. But I think it kind of fits a moment here that is relevant to how we're thinking about broader questions, because to the extent China wants to dominate international commerce, not just in Asia, but across the world, it has to have access points. And across its eastern seaboard, aren't that many, truly great ports with access into, the Bay of Bengal. And so I wonder, to the extent that this is going to be a recurring theme, in kind of how we think about not just that particular region, East Asia, but international affairs more broadly. Are we going to have more kind of choke point scenarios that people should be thinking through, or?
I think so. Well, listen, I do. Let me put it that way. And I think that's my differentiator in my thrillers is that unlike my contemporaries, I'm really weaving in true geopolitics. I'm showing you things that are about to happen on your doorstep tomorrow that you'll read about in the news tomorrow. Several summers ago, I set my book Black Ice up in the very northern part of Norway, and I dealt with the northern sea route and how China was working with the Russians to, in the summertime, be able to go up and over Russia and come down. You could shave 2 weeks off the trip from Shanghai to Rotterdam by going up and sailing through the slushy kind of summer thawed out waters above Russia. So this stuff is really important. In what do we know? It's that politics is downstream of culture, right? So I write books that I want people to just love. And I always tell people, if you've never read a Brad Thor book before, you can pick up the latest one. It's like going to see a Bond movie at your local movie theater. Doesn't matter if you've ever seen a Bond movie before, you get caught up right away and you know what's going on. But I like that people can read my books, short, crisp, cinematic chapters. You whip right through the books. And at the end, you close the book and you're like, wow, I actually learned a thing or two in this book. I'm actually smarter. I know more about what's going on in the world and why it's important. Because I think now more than ever, we have this tendency culturally to think all that matters is what's between the two coasts. We've got a very kind of isolationist view. Not everybody does, but a lot of us are not paying attention, or we think it doesn't matter. There's a certain current in the country that wants us to kind of return to isolationism, doesn't want us to be present on the world stage. And a lot of those things are very understandable. After two huge wars like Afghanistan and Iraq, there's a lot of battle fatigue. Nobody wants to go back to war. Nobody wants to have our sons and daughters bleeding overseas for wars that, you step back and say, what did we get out of it? Why did we do that? I can get into, I'm not a big fan of the fact that Iraq and Afghanistan got to establish constitutions based on Sharia law, which I think was a big mistake. I don't think that's democracy to allow religion to creep in, particularly Sharia law, which is so inhospitable to minorities, whether it's your sexual orientation, whether it's your gender, whether it's your faith, things like that. So I think Americans have a really good reason to be upset with the amount of time we've spent at war, the amount of blood and treasure. We've seen Congress, particularly, it was happening in the Nixon years, but especially it got turbocharged after Nixon. The Congress just cedes more of its authority to the executive. And so somebody who writes fiction, who deals with geopolitics, deals with domestic politics in the books, it is just wild to sit back and watch real life stuff, because there's some of these things I would never think to put in a book because nobody believe it.
Yeah, I just want to say, before you go, Nathan, I mean, you're one of the few authors who reminds me of that opening scene of the original BBC version of House of Cards, where the main character, Francis Urquhart, picks up, and this is in the opening sequence, a picture of Margaret Thatcher, and he says, all good things must come to an end. And then he puts the frame down. And what's remarkable about this is that it's right before sort of Margaret Thatcher is deposed, kind of constitutionally loses office. And in a sense, it's the entire House of Cards series, I think, is talking about political intrigue within Britain's government. But you're talking about this intrigue, which is constantly happening on the international stage. Sadly, there's no analogous scene in the Kevin Spacey Netflix version. But I just wanted to offer that because I think you're right on. Politics are upstream of culture, and as a kind of herald of the day, you're telling us what's coming. So.
Well, George, I will agree with you that there's nothing analogous in the Kevin Spacey version. In fact, my mind immediately went to, what do I remember from the opening episode? And it was that stupid water tower with a peach on it that looks like somebody's rear end. And he's dealing with the fact that that's in his district, I guess. And then there's a car crash because these stupid kids are always looking up at the big ass. That's the water tower. So that's a long way from somebody kind of turning Margaret Thatcher's photo upside down and saying all good things must come to an end. So kind of funny.
Real quick, I actually think that says something about U.S. culture, which is we are more predisposed to care about statues that look like buttocks as opposed to cultural references about Margaret Thatcher. And I would be willing to bet, outside of our listeners, if you ask the average American, what do you think of Margaret Thatcher? They'd say, who was Margaret Thatcher? You're talking about kinetic issues and everything else. You also write that Washington and Manila are desperate to avoid direct confrontation with Beijing, increasingly just relying on unofficial operators. Given the speed of information today, is it even possible to maintain deniability, or is the modern game simply about muddying the waters just enough to prevent a unified response?
It's a good question. I think, I talk about the Thucydides trap in the book, and this idea that, the strongest, biggest, fastest rising powers eventually, two biggest kids on the block are going to clash. That's what we said, all the way back for generations. Yeah, I mean, you think of all the asymmetric stuff that happens, all the gray zone conflict, all that kind of stuff. I mean, China and the U.S. don't want to go head to head. In fact, there was a great white paper that was written by, and I love that I can come on and talk like this. You guys are the only podcast where I know the audience likes this stuff. There was a great white paper that was written by two PLA Air Force colonels that was called, and they turned it into a book, and it was called Unrestricted Warfare. It was Yeah, exactly. That's the book. And what was so fascinating about that is they admitted that China, at least at the end of the last century, seems weird to say that, but we're in 2026, and that was 1999. But China said, we can't beat the U.S. on the conventional battlefield. So the way for us to beat the United States is to weaponize things that Americans take for granted, whether that's the electrical grid, whether that's, the internet was just starting to come on, things like that. How do we interrupt gas supplies getting to people's houses? How do we create something that makes it impossible in the fall for farmers to get their crops out of the ground so that Americans would starve going into the winter, kind of a thing. And now things have changed. It's very interesting. We were talking about the Strait of Hormuz before we started recording, and it was always kind of a hypothetical. Would the Iranians close the Strait of Hormuz? Would they be able to close the Strait of Hormuz? What would that look like? And now we've allowed that to be proven. And that essentially, the minute you allow a hypothesis to be proven, and if it's proven to the benefit of your enemy, you've now handed a weapon to your enemy. They've proven they can do it. These strikes on, neighbors in the region, things like that, and the impact that they've had on the economy is huge. I don't even think we've felt the full effects, to be honest with you, not yet. So we've seen a lot. Look at how well Ukraine has been able to hold off the Russians, and now look at Iran holding us off. So it's very interesting. The world is changing very, very rapidly, and I think so. Back to your original question, in the book where I talk about Manila and I talk about the U.S. and how and where they're willing to confront the Chinese. Listen, they're a nuclear power. We obviously don't want to go hot with the Chinese. But I think just like Russia was proven to be somewhat of a paper tiger, they thought they could take Kyiv in 3 days, and it's years later, and they still haven't been able to do it. I think there's a certain overconfidence in Chinese abilities. I'll put it that way. I think there are people that think the Chinese are much more capable than they are, just like there were a lot of people who thought the Russians were much more capable than they are.
That's an interesting point. You've been writing the Harvath series for 25 years. We're talking about this paper that came out in 99. Has the view from your perspective and in your eyes, American perspective, always seen China in this sort of like large, incredibly strong and terrifying force? Has that changed at all? And do you think it's always been overblown?
I will say this. As far as my readership is concerned, there has been a real shift to wanting to see stuff where China's the bad guy in the books. So I did a book called Deadfall 4 summers ago. And I'm a big fan of Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers. I mean, so great movie, great TV series. And I wanted to set my character. I always wished I could put him in a World War II scenario. So when Ukraine happened, I thought, oh my gosh, now I can write my World War II novel, but set it in the present day. So I could send my protagonist, Scott Harvath, over to Ukraine. There's a missing American aid worker. That's what gets him involved. And he has to wade through all of this horribleness, whether it's with, Wagner mercenaries, before Putin brought the jet down with the head of the Wagner group on there. And the response from the audience was really interesting because Trump has been so pro-Putin, because he's been so soft on Putin. There were a lot of people that didn't like seeing the Russians depicted as bad guys. And I thought, oh my God, I grew up in the Cold War, and the Russians have always been the bad guys. They're still the bad guys as far as I'm concerned. But this idea that somehow I was a propagandist because I was showing Ukrainians fighting against Russian invaders, and, whether it's the stuff they did in the Donbass with the little green men, or I'm drawing a blank. What's the city right outside Kyiv? I feel terrible that I forget the name, where they had all those war crimes that were committed, and they had like Bucha. Yeah. So it was very interesting to write that. And so, but I'm writing entertainment, and I just picked a setting. So the feedback, let me put it that way, the feedback was interesting to get. It wasn't all my readers, it was a handful. But when people are that heated about stuff, you really notice it. So I think the Chinese, we have such an interdependence, at least we did, and we still do, with manufacturing and things like this. This is kind of one of the bees that I get in my bonnet, is as much of a capitalist as I am and a believer in free markets. And I'm a small business person. I really do believe in all those things, and I support them. I'm limited government, free markets, free people. I believe America has a very important role to play in the world. One of the things that I never considered was, as we turn to maximizing shareholder value and shipping factory jobs overseas, in fulfilling orders overseas, nobody stopped, particularly representatives in these districts. Nobody ever stopped to say, okay, you got a mill in this town. This guy's grandfather worked in the mill and retired out of there. His dad worked in the mill and retired out of here. Now he just shows up at work and the mill's closed. And we never thought, what happens to these people? We're not going to retrain some guy at 45 to go and become a coder. And even if we did, he'd be out of work already because of AI. So as a creative, as somebody who loves politics, and as I told you guys offline, politics is my baseball. I would take a debate. I would take an election night. That's my Super Bowl, right? Like, I can't wait for the midterms. I love election night. It's the most exciting thing for me. But politics is downstream of culture. I'm trying to write about what's going to happen next and do it in a way that is exciting. So things keep rapidly changing. So it is interesting. I have not let up on the Russians because I think the Russians are evil. Or I think the Russian government is evil. There's so much culture. There's so much goodness in the actual Russian people, their culture, whether it's their love of music, of literature. There's a lot of good things about Russian history. They just got a terrible guy in charge. Same thing with the Chinese and the CCP. I think there's a lot of great things out of China. They just have a bad government. So anyway, that's the long roundabout way of saying that I've seen a big shift in my audience where there's a real desire to know more about China and what China's doing in the world, and a concern that China is the next thing that we're going to bump up against hard. And so I'm a small business. My Amazon reviews, my Goodreads reviews is a virtual suggestion box that sits in the virtual lobby of my business. And so when people go and give me those 4 stars after they read my book, that's my annual performance review. And if they write a comment on the comment card underneath the stars, I listen to that. I pay attention to it. And I think that's important. You know what your readers want to learn more about. So this kind of pivot to Asia in this book is partly because I had so many people interested in that area. And I thought, okay, cool. I could do a fun thriller here and people will walk away from the book a little bit smarter about why that area is important to not only the world in general, but America specifically.
And George, feel free to jump in, but let's take a brief look at the book. How has Harvath changed as a character and as a person as we head into this book, Chokepoint? What is different about him now?
Harvath is in the enviable position of having socked away enough money that he doesn't have to work again. And so Harvath, in a previous book, he had lost his wife. He had been recently married and his wife got murdered. And he took one more chance and he got married again. He married a beautiful young woman from the Norwegian intelligence service. He's the envy of all his buddies. They tease him because she's so much younger than he is. And she's really sharp. And he's always said that she's better at the spy game than he is. And the only thing he has over her is he's been at it longer. So he has more experience. But so I had a lot of stuff previously with the two of them. And I know some guys that are incapable, similar to Michael Jordan, when Michael Jordan was supposed to retire and he didn't retire and then he pivoted to baseball and all that kind of stuff, or Tom Brady, where everybody would say Tom Brady's out and then Tom Brady comes back. So this book with Harvath, it's fun because Harvath takes a team with him and it opens up in the Philippines. It was great. I just did an interview the other day and the host is, I'll tell you guys offline, he's a super smart guy and very, very well known in kind of policy circles in DC and everything. And he said, gosh, I didn't even know this island in the Philippines that you start off describing, that it's the northernmost island and it's the closest to Taiwan, and that we do a lot of cross training with the army, with our military and the Philippine military. We do a lot of stuff with them. And the Chinese don't like it because we've got missile batteries over there that can hit mainland China from the Philippines, blah, 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 blah. So Harvath even though he doesn't have to work a day in his life again, chooses to. And I've always said that the biggest lesson I learned writing these books, the biggest lesson that my fictional character, Scott Harvath, has taught me is that there is no American dream without those willing to protect it. So it doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter how you vote. It doesn't matter what your job is. We all share in common that we're Americans. And the great thing about being an American is that it doesn't require you to be born here. It requires your support of and your belief in a certain set of ideals. Japan's not going to make you a citizen. You're not going to be Japanese, but here anybody can be American. And so this idea that we have to protect what this 250-year-old experiment in democracy weaves its way in, not like there's huge boxes and people waving flags in every chapter, but it is subtle and it is in there that if we want to preserve what we have, it involves a certain amount of sacrifice. And so that's what's fun about the books is I get to look at people who sacrifice in different ways. And so there's always that element in each one of my thrillers.
Do you think, that there's anything to that kind of dynamic, which I think, I want to use a fictional example here, but, in that scene, Charlie Wilson's War, where, the CIA representative is talking to the Julia Roberts character, who's this sort of flamboyant, Texas heiress who's interested in the Middle East. He says to her, basically, you're someone with too much time and too much money on your hands. And usually that's a recipe for disaster. Do you think that in a way you're kind of pushing back on the idea that, kind of Americans with kind of this outsized influence in international affairs, can be a force for good? There are classic, contemporary examples of this. I think of, all the folks that are kind of obsessed with nuclear nonproliferation who, have really, I think, pushed on that note quite a bit. But I just raise it as an issue. What do you think?
Well, it is interesting, and I have to give a plug for Julia Roberts. We watched the series where she played. Was it Mitchell? Is it Martha Mitchell? Margaret Mitchell?
Martha
Mitchell.
Yes, I know exactly who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. And she played, it was fantastic. She was so good in that role. It was absolutely unbelievable. And Netflix has got a great documentary actually on the real person, but Julia Roberts' depiction was fantastic. It is interesting. We are living through a time right now, particularly with the current administration, where the more money somebody has, the more adept at anything they are believed to be. So we see people who may be very good in their particular fields of business who think that applies everywhere. So the bigger your bank account, the smarter you are. I was watching something as I was making coffee this morning and learned that Elon Musk's father is over in Russia right now and with Putin, and he's with somebody from British politics as Belfast is burning, as homes of immigrants or kind of way stations or kind of temporary housing for immigrants are being lit on fire. And I think of how Musk got involved. Like we talked about Doge and the elimination of USAID, and this kind of everybody was cheering and thought it was fantastic. And again, nobody likes waste, fraud, and abuse, but are you going in with a sledgehammer? You going in with a scalpel, and do you actually understand what cancer looks like so that when you see it, you can cut it out? And I just think that there are a lot of people that the bigger their bank accounts get, the smarter they think they are. So, yeah. And but there have been historically, Charlie Wilson's War is it's a fabulous book. I own the book, and it was a great movie with Philip Seymour Hoffman and Tom Hanks. And so if you want to shortcut it and watch the movie was pretty good. I thought the movie was pretty close to the book and is very interesting. But there's always been this kind of desire for Americans who are particularly wealthy Americans who want to have some sort of an influence and who can afford to put money into different causes and see that happen. Sometimes it's for the better. Sometimes it's not for the better. But I know what listen. The Soviet Union collapsed shortly after they pulled out of Afghanistan. So I don't see much that happened from any American that wasn't a good contributor to that. So I'm all for that. Yeah. I'm all for that.
Yeah.
With Cold Zero, when you were here last time, you wrote it with Ward Larsen. How has working with a partner in that format changed your approach to these solo novels? Does it change
Good
how you write them
question.
at all?
No, because I've spent my entire career up until just last year being a solo writer. I always say that I'm absolutely convinced that James Bond was Ian Fleming's alter ego. And if you know anything about Fleming and his predilections, the Bond character makes even more sense. I'm pretty convinced that Jack Ryan was Tom Clancy's alter ego, and Harvath is definitely my alter ego. When my wife is not around to hear me, I joke and say, Harvath gets to do all the things my wife won't let me do. That's always my joke with him. So I've learned good things with Ward. He's a real detail-oriented guy, and I've always believed that details are the bedrock of a good thriller, because there is this social contract that you have with readers as an author, which is the reader agrees to suspend their disbelief, and you agree to write to the best of your ability so that you don't give them like speed bumps that they kind of go, wait a second, and it bumps them out of the story, right? So I'm incredibly finicky when I read, and this is just a silly thing. I know firearms very well, and so when somebody puts a manual safety, like on a Glock, I know this person doesn't understand firearms, and that gives me that bump, right? It takes me out of the story, because now I'm like, okay, that's not hard to figure out. You couldn't be bothered to do the research. You just assumed. How many other things in your book did you assume? So if anything with Ward, he's so detailed. We've had great conversations. Elmore Leonard had a wonderful suggestion to young writers, the great crime writer Elmore Leonard. And he said he gave young writers 2 pieces of advice. Number 1, never start with the weather. It was a dark and stormy night. He's like, don't do that. Number 2, leave out the parts that people skip. And my dad used to swear. My dad was such a Clancy fan, and my dad would swear that those Clancy books, that Clancy was paid by the word. And I remember reading the Clancy books and saying, okay, I don't need 15 pages about how the guidance system on a missile works. All I need to know, and all I write in my books, is that there's two fifth group guys that are lasing a target. I explain that the laser can't be seen by the human eye, but the missile can find it. You put the laser on the target, that's how the missile hits, and that's good. And I'm done in a couple of sentences. So there have been things about how Ward is so precise with his language and what details to put in, what details to put out, that there's no question. My having worked with such a great author like Ward, he was a A-10 Warthog fighter pilot, and then went to work for Southwest for a long time, just retired a couple of months ago. I learned a lot from him. So it's definitely made my writing better from having partnered with him on our first co-written book this winter.
Yeah. Real quick, and George, of course, if you have other questions, feel free. But one of the last questions I have for you, I ask some variation of this to all of our guests, especially who write, is 1, do you feel that your readers are still maintaining the attention spans they had 5 or 10 years ago? And do you worry that with everyone having TikTok and YouTube and all the baloney out there that sort of takes the mind and squeezes its dopamine out, that people will lose the ability to actually sit down and read these very good, frankly, very good, but not very hard 300-page books? Because I don't know anyone who reads. I actually was on a trip over the last week, and someone was like, what's the last book you read? And he said, Holes. Granted, that was in 2003. Do you worry that your industry might die because people are becoming dumb?
I'm now going to have my office swept again, because you just brought up the thing that we talk about so often inside the office. So there was an interesting poll that was done in the last year, Ipsos NPR. Okay, talked about reading, and that's a fabulous poll. I encourage everybody to go look at it. It's just fascinating. And then I just came across a recent thing from a group called iScience. And what they did, and CNN covered this on their website, iScience gave people booklets, much like old previous generations who were Nielsen families. So the Nielsen ratings company used to have a diary, and you would write down what you watched, what time, what channel, all that kind of stuff. So iScience did that for people's reading. And what they found is that people who read deeply are reading even more, but they're only doing it at home. They're not reading outside the home, which is interesting, because you used to see people on the train and you'd see this book and you'd see the book cover 5 times over the course of a week and say, oh my God, that's 5 different people reading that book. I bet it's really good. The biggest threat to my industry really is, as you said it, is what happens to the brain when people are on Instagram in particular. When you're flicking through there, you actually get these little hits of dopamine. It's I call it kind of a digital opium den, except an opium den, you don't even have to do half the work you do on Instagram. You just sit there and put your head on the block of wood and suck on a pipe, whereas Instagram, you have to spend 2 calories every time you do this, right? But the experience is very difficult. So reading takes discipline. In fact, I know myself, if I have my phone and I want to read, I turn it off. I put it in a do not disturb mode, and I put it out of reach when I'm reading. So I'm not tempted if the book kind of slows down a bit or I finish a chapter to pick up the phone. So yes, I am concerned about that because the experience reading, while it makes you more empathetic, it actually makes you a better leader. There's all of this information about how good it is to read, particularly fiction, and to see the story through different points of view and everything. There's a lot of good positive things that happen in the brain and inside the body, but those dopamine hits are not one of them. And I'd say that if you go back and you read my first book, my chapters were 15 pages long. Now you would get 5 3-page chapters in that space. I wouldn't do a 15-page chapter because I want people to feel like, oh, it was a 2.5-page chapter. I can do another one. That was easy. And I can do another one. So my writing has definitely changed to try to keep up with I'm in the entertainment business, right? I talk about what I hope people learn from the books, but first and foremost, it's toes in the sand, book in the hand. I want you to have a great thrill ride. I liken what I do. I have an amusement park. Every year I create a new roller coaster. And now that I'm co-writing, I create 2 roller coasters a year. So I just want you to have fun. But I have to keep up with the competition, which is Netflix and Instagram and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. But do you think then that me and our listeners are fine to trade Instagram for opium? Is that what I'm hearing? Like we're good to go?
I'm going to, your mileage may vary. You may have different experiences. I would suggest you consult with your tax professional, your legal professional, and your medical professional before you decide to sub in chasing the dragon for Instagram.
I love the geopolitical analysis. That's what we're here for. That's what we're about. But I also love Harvath's sort of story. And I appreciate you detailing sort of how he's changed as a person. I think his middle life crisis of finding an attractive younger wife is appropriate for where he is in the series. But my final question about him, will he ever find peace, inner peace at all? Without Instagram and opium?
I don't think it's possible. I don't think somebody who's devoted their life to the country, and that's part of what's wrong with him too, is that he doesn't think anybody coming up behind him can do the job as well as he can. It is an endearing quality, but it's also one of his deepest flaws, in that he thinks he's better, stronger, faster than anybody else that gets assigned to work with him. And so management would like him to come out of the field and identify the next younger version of himself, and he refuses. His thing is either you put me in the field or I'll find someplace else to work. And that's a very dangerous, there's a certain lack of humility there, a certain amount of hubris. A lot of it's driven by patriotism and his belief in doing what's right. I always say that if you're going to set somebody loose on the world stage and you tell them there's no rules, you don't have to follow the rules, that has to be somebody with an incredible moral compass. You can't send a sadist out to do that job and not put any shackles on them. So yeah, Harvath's going to keep going, and I don't see riding off into the simple sunset. This book is kind of about the fact that he went on a 6-month honeymoon, and his wife looked at him and she said, "You got to go back to work. There's not enough. You don't play golf. You don't. There's one thing you do, and you do it well, and you need to keep doing it. You've still got a lot of fight left in you." And so that's where Harvath is.
Well, Brad, we've had a chance to cover the impacts of social media and AI to geopolitics between China and the U.S. The book is fantastic. Choke Point. Where can people find it?
The old line, wherever fine books are sold. It comes out on June 16th. It makes a great Father's Day gift. And I've got lots of links at bradthor.com. And in fact, if you get your order in early enough, I am going to be doing one last personalization. So I can sign it directly to Dad and put in a note for you. And so you go to bradthor.com, you'll see where I'm doing signed books.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.